Hi, I'm Korkut Onaran. I'm an adjunct faculty in University of Colorado, Denver. I've been teaching since '97, and I also have my own practice, Pel-Ona Architects and Urbanists. We, as the name suggests, do urbanism, architecture, and urban planning. And I'm the president of the CNU Colorado, the Colorado chapter of Congress for the New Urbanism. I'm shamelessly promoting my book as well. Just came out, form-based codes, crafting form-based codes, and the paperback is going to come out this Friday. Thank you.
So I'm going to start talking about sprawl. We always talk about sprawl. Everybody complains about sprawl, but how can we define, what is sprawl? And then we all complain, but what exactly is wrong with it? And then we're going to talk about how do we undo it or not do it? What are some of the principles we can follow? And when we talk about those, there are the big picture principles and some much more detailed urban design scale principles. So everything you're seeing bright white is going to be urban design 101. But that in itself needs a larger framework to make sense. That's why we're asking the big question, what is sprawl? So when we use the word, people usually think about something like this. Urban area growing, so London, how it grew. When we look at the black, not only it grew, but it leapfrogged. So we started to see some areas growing, not attached to the urban. So leapfrog is definitely one of the properties. But the reality is not black and white. There are a lot of shades of gray. And, when you look at a place like Evergreen, house per acre, house for 2 acres, then you're talking about a very gray area. And then we talk about density. Lower the density, more sprawl, we talk about it. And, when you move close to Denver, the densities change and grows. Now, on top of that, when we look at the sprawl landscapes, we see a lot of the single use, just residential, just one type of residential, just this size of lot, this size of house, this level of income, etc., and so forth. So we have that gradation. So when we say single use, it's not just residential, but we made it so that nowadays we have really fine stratum of different single users. And it's not just about the periphery. It's in the middle of a very urban area we start seeing some of those single-use areas. The Polo Club, in the middle of a very dense urban area, you're having really low dense and high income houses. And they're very similar in character. So again, single use is not just a black and white, it's a gray, it's a scale. Another thing we see, it's segmented, we potted, single families here, duplexes here, apartments here, retail here, office park, industry, etc., so forth. And we separate those each other and create a segmented landscape. And because of that, this particular way of growing is very car dependent. Without a car, you don't go in between these elements. So I kind of listed leapfrogged, low density, single use, segmented, and car dependent. And again, any of these are not black and white, gray areas exist, and therefore some areas are more sprawled than the others. Some areas are more single use than the others, etc., so forth. So that gives us an idea. It's not density. Just take any of these single ones. It's not enough to define what sprawl is. It needs to have the other qualities so that we can talk about sprawl. So this is interesting. This is from a book, Sustainability on Cities. The authors are looking at the traditional city, small, walkable, and then we started to see the streetcar. You see the shape of the traditional city still there. And then these are really new centers 20s, 30s, all the way to 40s. And then after the war, we have this. You can see the traditional city in the center, and then the railroads. But beyond that, we created areas where low density single use, but also the only way to get there you have to use your car. There's no transit. There's really limited other option. And we all familiar with these, and then we forget about them. It's like when we get into the details, what is its role? So let's get into why is it wrong? What does it do? Well, because of the car dependency, it's a very inefficient form of transportation. We maximize the miles we're driving. And there are several problems with that. But, this pattern, I like this. This is Leon Crier. He has a lot of these sketches, In the Front Range, we don't experience this anymore, this strong. But there are still a lot of metropolitan areas in the United States that, at night, everybody goes to suburb. The downtown is dead. And during the day, people come to the, mostly male, come to the center, and as a result of this pattern, you see this rush hour traffic congested. We build a lot of highways, and they're still congested because we made it such that we really maximize the amount of miles everybody travels. We separated, podding. When we put the different single uses in different pods, we maximize the traveling in between them. This is a nice comparison from Peter Kalthoff's book, 1960 and 2005. Transportation-related data. Cars per household increased, the percent of income. This is very important. The percent of income that goes to the transportation for average family is going up. But it's going really high for lower income, which creates a social justice issue. That is to say, the most affordable housing type is way out there in the cornfields, but that comes with 35% of their income going to the transportation related. If you have 2 cars and all the expenses that goes with that adds up, especially if you have a limited income. And that creates a lot of issues. And it's a social justice issue for us, planners. And the most striking data is here. That is to say, we more than doubled the average miles we're driving each day or per week. We have a lot of environmental problems related with that. The emissions are really high compared with other countries in average. This is, when you look at the carbon imprint, the emissions, it's interesting. That is to say, these are the comparison of different sectors. We're really doing okay between 1960 and 2008 in terms of industrial. We cleaned our act, basically. But when we look at the transportation, that's increasing and keeps going there. So that kind of, and another interesting thing, commercial and residential buildings, commercial increased a little bit, but residential not much. So we're growing fast, but we learned how to do better, lower the carbon imprint of the residential. The biggest problem is transportation. We're really not addressing the transportation. It creates segmentation in the landscape. There is this, I like this book. It's a very, Landscape Ecology Principles. It's a very simple, graphic-oriented book. In any habitat, there's the core of the habitat, which is the richest, most diverse. And when we interrupt that, this may be I-70, this may be a county road. Of course, the damage it's creating are different. I-70 is a much important interruption. But what happens is that all of a sudden you start to get the peripheral boundary geometrically increased, and therefore geometrically smaller core where you have the diversity. And the size of the patch matters because the larger the size, the more diverse biodiversity you have in it. And smaller the patch, the smaller is the diversity. Smaller diversity usually is vulnerable for certain diseases and disasters, etc., so forth. If it is larger, it can recover itself easily. Therefore, when we segmented the landscape to smaller patches, we're increasing the distinction of certain species pretty high. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but we have, a whole slew of social problems related with that. One thing is that when you start to spend 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of your day commuting, that takes away from your socialization. That takes away from, we call them third spaces, third places. You have the home, you have the work, and then a place to go and socialize, pubs, tea houses, etc., so forth. First thing you cancel from your daily life is that particular third place because you're spending 3 hours on the road. And that creates a lot of other problems. Stress, the divorce rate among the commuters is really high. And interestingly enough, in itself, the life is not sustainable. That is to say, when you look at the moving patterns in the commuters, they move a lot because they're not satisfied where they are. They kind of hold on there. Yeah, I'm going to drive 3 hours, 4 years, 5 years, and then they move. And that's a small part of their life. And, research keeps showing that, that's for a lot of people the worst part of their lives. That is to say, they learned a lot, certain things, and then, etc. It affects the family structure, the kids, the amount of time you're spending with the kids also go down, etc., so forth. And then, as I mentioned, there's a social justice issue. We need to address the fact that lower income families spending more in percentage to the transportation. Comes with infrastructure maintenance. We're facing that more and more lately, especially in Colorado, when we built a lot in 50s and 60s. Now we're taking care of those roads that are getting old, and we're realizing that they're really expensive. And comes with other utilities and alike. Health-related problems. This is Jim Charlier, certain, I'll read it. Public health is becoming a huge factor in our economy and is directly affected by our transportation choices. We are spending a lot of money compared with other nations, but the most important statistics comes with obesity, especially the diabetes, the rate of the diabetes. This is 1990. You can see that there's a 15 to 20% here, and then I'll just go through the years. In 2000, they added a new category all the way to 25%. That is, 1 out of 4 people you see has the problem. And then 2003, all the way to the 30% category here, the red. And then we added more, 2009, and goes to 35%. It's more than 1 person out of 3 in those particular states, and that's the last one I have. And as you can see, it's an epidemic, and it's really connected with the transportation choices. And it's very simple. That is to say, if you're spending 3 hours, 4 hours of your day driving, that really leaves limited to anything else, including the physical activity. Another interesting information is the highest life expectancy in all metropolitan areas, including all the suburbs, is Manhattan in the United States. And that's how you realize that it's directly related with walking, because they walk the most. So, okay, now we know what sprawl is and we know what it does to us. So how do we deal? What are the design techniques and planning techniques we can use to not do it or undo it, meaning that now that we did build all these suburbs, how do we deal with what we have? So I'm going to go through, these are the attributes, I put it there, and then, one by one, trying to match the alternative. Instead of leapfrog, let's do contiguous, dense, compact. That means try to use what we have in the urban area first, and when we're doing that, make it compact. This work we did for Englewood. It's under construction. And one point, we have a lot, you can see a lot of consultants doing a lot of projects. One thing I want to underline here is that when you say compactness, this is a brownfield. We started to search the small lot. That is, okay, what is the smallest lot we can get for single family? We have 27 feet frontage in that particular project and try to give, most of the important amenities of single family in that particular lot. So when we say compact, it's not just, repeat the kind of building types we used to do in the new project. It's explore in more detail how can we make that kind of dense, small lot, row home more livable, comparable with some of the amenities that we provide in single family. How can we do that? Is a more architectural level, urban design level exploration, and it's part of the job. As well as going and addressing the most undesirable parts of the towns. This is 72nd and Bradburn, Westminster. It's really underused, kind of tough area, and the city, Westminster, really encourages actually almost kind of like a aggressively active, proactive, goes, solicits different developers to come and build that particular place. And when you look at a place like that, you're really doing very tailored, small interventions as much as possible and try to create really maybe in some cases, 1,000 square feet, 800 square feet, small business spaces, etc., so forth. Really understand the market of what is needed in that particular area and respond to that. Again, we have this idea that, mixed use, all the ground floors are going to be retail and apartments upstairs. Well, that works in some areas. That doesn't work at all in other areas, especially in a place like this. It needs something totally different. So understanding that is part of the equation and responding to that. And it's not a place you're going to get a lot of development value because you're really trying to start the life there. And it starts with something very small buildings, small residential, the first maybe 4 or 5 really compact row homes and small businesses, and then it grows changing from there. And infill is definitely part of it. This is, the Evans is right here actually, and this is Holly. A lot of these corridors, retail corridors, you see a front row, and then behind the front row, really kind of oddball industries, underused areas, storages, etc., so forth. How can we go into those kind of places and create value out of those? That's an experimentation of that. That is to say, can we put a street and some parks and really create a neighborhood behind a row of retail corridor? So there's the word compact there. I'm going to take a small break and go to the urban design. So this is Urban Design 101. So I do these a couple of times. I'm going to do compactness and urban space. And a little bit of the history, what do we mean by compactness? This is a town, a village, Cameron. As you can see, there are these tiny little huts, but they came together and created a wall and created an inner and outer space. And inner space is where the village life happens. And that's the way the urban space is created. That is to say, you face each other. If I turn my back and talk and I didn't have this, we didn't have a good conversation. That is to say, we need to face each other. And it's the same thing with the urban environment. And in this particular case, these are all similar size of huts. In More complex urban environments, those are not the similar size of activities. Some are bigger, some of them smaller. As you can see, you know, there's temples and markets. This is the agora of the forum. This is open air, and these are several buildings around. But the way they hide themselves behind the colonnade and use every inch of that border of the urban space is very important. That is to say, they touch each other so that they can face to that area. And they are behind the colonnade. I'm going to come back to that. That is to make, they don't express themselves, every one of them, because then it would be clutter. There's this order, you know, they're quietly participating in the urban life. Turn of the century, that is 1900s. A big figure for us, urban design world, is Camillo Sitte. He's the first scholar who started to look at the European urban spaces to understand what are some of the design principles behind that. So in Austria, they made him a stamp. That's why I put that there. And he tells us that in a lot of these cases, the entrances are very important. You know, we have this grid now, and goes, you know, when you stand on the street corner, the view goes to the eternity, right? What he says is that usually that's not the case. Usually you have the T, you know, if a road comes in, ends here. This road comes in, ends here. So as you can see, these are, exactly, Santa Fe, yeah, a good example. Usually you end up with a vista terminating. Or there are some, you know, this is the Siena Piazza del Campo. These are the entrances. They're really hidden. Again, you know, if you stand in the plaza and look out, you're not seeing a vista that goes to the horizon. And that really creates this enclosure that is important. And sometimes, like this case, yeah, there's a street opening, but open to the wall, and then you split up from there. So that enclosure is important. And another interesting principle, he says, we need to keep the center of the plaza empty so that we can see each other. It's kind of like, in especially 1800s, they started to put these monuments in the smack middle of the plaza, and he says that that's like putting a big flower in the dining table so that you can't talk to each other. It's the same thing about the buildings, that you need to empty that area so that two sides can talk to each other. So go back to our list. The next, you know, single use versus mixed use. Now, mixed use is kind of overrated term as well. So I want to work on it a little bit further. And I call it self-sufficient. Again, it's not a black and white. There are levels of self-sufficiency, and you never get the full self-sufficiency. But when you look at single-use environments, you realize that they are extremely self-sufficient. Only one type of activity happens, and for any other activity, you need to go out of there. And that's related with the intensity of the public realm and diversity, which will gonna come to that. This is again Leon Crea, you know, a flower has a balance. We kind of sometimes overgrow certain parts. That's kind of an analogy of the way we grow in an urban area. Anyway, this is a picture from the design book we participated in preparing for Forest City for North Stapleton neighborhoods. And they asked us to look at the gardening opportunities. And all of a sudden we realized that, you know, adding a garden, you know, these are houses facing a common court. And part of the common court is community gardens, and one small building is dedicated to that, you know, for landscaping, etc., so forth, tools. So when you do something like that, all of a sudden, it's not just a gardening opportunity, but also the social life. That is to say, the life in this particular neighborhood starts to change. You know, that starts to be a third place, socialization place. You go out, you see your neighbor, etc., so forth. And in terms of self-sufficiency, you become a little bit more self-sufficient just because you have that facility next to your house. So again, it's not about just, oh, let's put retail, let's put this use and that use. No, there may be different ways, the common elements in any residential new development gives you an amazing potential to what you can do in terms of self-sufficiency. We're working with another developer trying to do a community house where she's trying to put some workplaces that, small cubicles that, if you have a small business and you don't have to have your meeting in Starbucks anymore, you can have your community house because they have, you're provided a small conference room and cubicles and video conferencing possibilities. I mean, it's better than a golf club. So again, to understanding that, what this particular community may need to be more self-sufficient. What am I doing in time? Another example, this one corner, in a street corner, you provide a community gardens. This is a sketch by Leon Crea I love a lot, and this is about the public realm. When we say public realm, everybody thinks, oh yeah, we should do a library over there and a plaza. It's important, but the way you integrate that to the fabric is more important. The proximity between the front buildings and the rest, you have the foreground buildings, civic buildings, you have the residential, and the way you bring them together is important. And when the proximity is there, then the effect of that civic use to the rest of the community maximized. And it's a much more self-sufficient community. These are mile squares from Ellen Jacobs' book, Streets book. It's the same mile square. You look at the Portland, you look at suburban development. Obviously, you started to see a lot of street corners. That means a lot of life, a lot of civic life, a lot of functions, and you start to get an idea that how intense the life can be. And when you compare a business park complex to Venice, for instance, the contrast gets even further. And just to give an idea of when we say civic intensity, that's what we mean. That is to say, every square feet is accommodating something. The last in this long sentence, mixed use, self-sufficient, intense, public realm, diverse. And diversity is, this is a transit-oriented development in Thornton, East Lake. The East Lake station is right here, and this is under review for entitlement. And looking at different building types, living lifestyles. Not only that, bringing these different types on the same block face. How can we do that to increase that diversity? Another interesting example is Holiday Neighborhood in Boulder. It's a very unique model where the city acquired the land, the whole thing, hired a consultant, subdivided, and solicited small developers to come in and develop different blocks. And the color code represents different developers. So you can see like 6 developers develop this different parts of the community. And following some guidelines, of course, but that in itself brought a lot of diversity to the neighborhood. And again, diverse is highlighted there because we're going to take another break to the urban design. Diversity and urban space. Now, we started with this. And, we hear this word place attachment a lot lately in a lot of city halls. But, when we start thinking about what is it, there are different thoughts. Some say it doesn't matter. The corner I met my significant other is a very important place for me, but it may not be for you. So there's that relativity. But there's another view that says, what if we attach certain values together collectively? Then we would be disturbed by the infringement to that particular place. And thus comes the argument of icons. You know, Statue of Liberty is an icon, and if you put up graffiti, every one of us are going to be angry about it. And interestingly enough, starting with 60s, courts started to accept that argument as a legal base for protection of certain places. Now, interestingly enough, the more social a place, the more likely that we're going to have some memories of that place collectively. You know, Larimer Square is a significant place for most of us because we remember a lot of things there. We spend time, and it's an important place. And so is this, because the whole village life happens there. It's a very significant place, memorable place for them. So there's that connection between the level of social activity in a public space and how much we are attached to that place in time, collectively. Same goes to the forums. Now, when we create a compact place, there are a lot of different functions, there are a lot of different spaces accommodating different activities, and their shapes and forms are very different. When they line up very close to each other, there's a likelihood that they're going to create clutter, and that happens a lot. And one other thing, Sept realized that there are ways to organize and get rid of that clutter. One way is, you know, decide if there are 3 competing facades, decide that this is the important facade because it's a church, then maybe we can do something quieter and symmetrical on the other to emphasize the third facade. And this is what happened in the Piazza Santissima. You know, there were 2 dominant buildings, and then, maybe we can put a colonnade repeating this, that would bring this forward. Another interesting example is Campidoglio. That is to say, there were 2 buildings, and then by creating the symmetry on the space and highlighting the palazzo, you're really creating a balanced environment. He realized that, you know, there are some broad plazas arranged in front of wide facades, city halls most of the time, and there are deep plazas arranged in front of the tall facades. So that's, you know, we're not going to do that in our places. We're not, you know, the churches and town halls, yeah, still they're important civic buildings, but it's, the environment we're working is more complex. But it gives us an idea that, you know, if there's a vertical emphasis, we need to balance the rest of what we're seeing in that particular plaza or street or public space. If we're looking at a broad like this one, then probably we're organizing a broad facade. And interestingly enough, in Paris, the Beaubourg Center, it's a modern building, follows exactly the same principle. It's a dominant building, broad facade, and it has a broad, beautiful plaza in front of it so that we can enjoy that piece of architecture. And it also, you know, one of the facades are very important. The other is kind of resting its back to a neighborhood. And that's another thing, you know. We tend to kind of do 4-sided buildings in the middle of the plaza, even today. That may not be the best attitude. And sometimes you see the groupings, you know, one after the other. You know, you start seeing this and then this church, etc. And sometimes interlocking. That is to say, there are 2 sub-plazas. One is looking at this facade, and interestingly enough, when you go to the place, actually not this, but this facade, which is here, that organizes that particular space. And obviously, when you're in the big San Marco, you see the facade, which is not enough vertical. That's why the tower, they added the tower just to balance that a little bit. And we see these kind of relations a lot in the Renaissance and medieval towns. And there's also, let me go back up a little bit. There are sequences that is memorable. And you go through the, you know, you look at the map, it's a maze. Oh my God, I'm going to lose my way. But you don't. You walk around, and in an hour, you know the place. And that's because each of these streets give you a different vista, and that vista, you remember that. I mean, we're familiar that with the 17th Street, you know, it's different than other grid streets in Denver because of the Union Station and the way the skyscraper, the TIA, ends this vista. And that starts to be part of your memory. So, again, we're going back to the list. Segmented versus integrated and connected. And this is a, Andres Duani's nice sketch. This is the way you pod things. This is the way you bring them together. And still, in terms of the land use, yeah, there's a district here, the neighborhood, that is mostly residential, there is mostly retail, but the grid brings them together, and certain key urban spaces bring them together. And it's a very different experience than this. And, we usually simplify things in our mind, but the devil is in the details. When you provide a plaza like this, and the proximities, walking proximities, we tend to forget how important that is in creating these kind of integrity. Integrated, connected, and finally car dependent. Again, you can do transit-oriented development, increase and livability and such, but in itself, walking is a big subject. How do you make sidewalks more walkable? Beyond that, how do you make walking a pleasurable act in these neighborhoods? Traffic calming is important. Why? Because of this. This is a residential fatality accidents statistics. You go 35, 40, you're really increasing the chance of fatality in the accidents. That is the reason why residential streets need to stay in 20, 25 miles an hour. That's what it says. So how do we do that? And all of these are are related to traffic calming as well as making walking a pleasure. Skinny streets, it's very simple. It's one of the most important aspects. Make the streets narrower. And we have so many examples in Denver, established neighborhoods where this works perfectly. Then we go and build new streets, and all of a sudden 34, 36, 40, curb to curb, and sometimes not even allowed to park on the on street. So every single project my office is doing, we're fighting against the cities to make the streets narrower. Street trees are very important. The closer they are to the running traffic, the more effective they are to remind the driver the speed, because you see those passing one by one. And also it creates a really pleasant shaded environment for the sidewalk. On-street parking creates friction, therefore slows down the traffic. That's really important too. Building presence, bringing the buildings closer to the sidewalk, not only increases the interaction, but also reminds the drivers the existence of life. Even if you don't see anybody, if you see a porch close enough to the sidewalk, there's the chance that somebody can come out of there, so you automatically slow down. Other examples, and of course, the use of alleys make a big difference in that as well. Because when you do the alleys, not only you don't have driveways cutting the sidewalk periodically, but also you have more amount of buildings per distance facing the sidewalk. Therefore, it's kind of like the street trees. Automatically communicates that this is an intense living place, so we better slow down. This is a sketch from guidelines we wrote. Building presence is good, but usually I see a lot, you put a front door and that's it. The rest is a wall of the house. That is to say, there's nothing in the house facing the street. It faces the backyard, private realm. The more the social parts of the house can see the sidewalk visually, the more chance that that sidewalk is going to be a walkable sidewalk. And that's what you're seeing. That is, there's a porch, there's the person, and you can really recognize that person. Again, we have this in a lot of the established neighborhoods, and we just don't value this in the new construction. And when you provide enough space, even in an apartment complex, you start to have life. And then the presence of life itself, you know, not just residential, maybe other uses as well. Even when you see a bench or a group of street furniture, that communicates existence of life, in spite of the fact that there may be nobody there, but still you slow down. So, we have the list here. Contiguous, dense, compact, mixed-use, self-sufficient, civic intensity, public realm, integrated, connected, walkable, bikeable, transit-oriented. Easier said than done, of course, but kind of give us a good framework, which is what I try to do. So just again, this is the kind of gist of it. Sprawl, some of the policies and strategies, and in more detail what we can do in the urban design realm. That's it. Oh. Thanks. Go ahead. Thank you. There's one there, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
It's always easier to incorporate good design and good design practices into more establishment sidewalks over new developments. Are there some newer developments in the Denver area that you consider to be taking this?
Yes, we're actually pretty lucky in that. The list is pretty lengthy. I mean, the first comes to my mind, Stapleton. You know, we criticize certain parts of it, but what it achieved in time is pretty remarkable. The mixing the income levels, creating life on the streets, and now more emphasis on sustainable green infrastructure. Those are very important. Another comes to my mind, you know, the Bradburn, the Prospect in Longmont, you know, those are, and Holiday Neighborhood is a very interesting example because of the model it brought. You know, city can be really a proactive player in the game. And Holiday Neighborhood in Boulder, that's exactly what they did. They increased the level of affordability required because they're like a, you know, the developer. Okay, this is the land, we own it. If you want to buy from us, you need to provide 30% affordable housing. You crunch numbers, you like it, you buy it, or not, you don't. So, yeah, the question?
Actually, a comment on your last piece that talked about front porches and not just a front door on a blank wall. One of the things that I heard was that at the turn of the 20th century, in Denver, they encouraged everybody's front door to have significant glazing in order to activate the street, to connect the housing with the street so people don't feel more isolated. And we've been replacing glazed doors with solid slab panels that really break up that connection.
Yeah. I mean, there's the privacy issue as well. Shutters are a good idea, you know, the binders, curtains, etc., so forth. The point is actually, you know, a household has a significant, I mean, limited amount of social life. You have maybe dinner in your backyard, maybe you hang out looking at the garden, etc., so forth. It used to be such that that was in the backyard. That was mostly on the front. If you want to hang out, you go to the porch and look at the street and passerbys. So that changed in the way we approach the houses. We put that kind of social thing into the private realm now, not to support the street life. So that's why we need to maybe shift that a little bit. Yeah, you have a backyard, but maybe your kitchen or dining room opens to the porch, and sometimes you sit and eat at the porch so that you can say hi to the passerby. I mean, that was so part of the life in the 30s and 40s, and it changed. So is there a way to go back to that? You know, the details, you know, if you're a very private person, yeah, you shut down the curtains. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So in urban design,
acting, everyone's pretty drawings and all their plans. And is urban design beginning to realize that they have to take that into account, like with public toilets and showers and accommodations, houses, small houses for that population? Otherwise, they risk spoiling it, that all the nice plans will be spoiled by their presence in the city. And I'm not condemning them. I think homeless people are should not be homeless. But the fact of the matter is that there are very part, like 85,000 homeless people living downtown Los Angeles. They're encroaching on all the pretty plans. In Europe, they have social democracy. In the United States, we have sort of sink or swim. So is that entering into the conscious of urban design?
Well, it's a pretty larger scale issue to be addressed, I believe. I'll give you an anecdote from my experience. I used to do these architectural tours in Europe with a bus full of students, architectural students, and go visit different towns and places. We visited many towns in Germany. The centers are usually very clean, neat, and such. And then we went to Amsterdam. My first reaction, I remember, there's a big plaza in front of the train station. It was full with people sitting on the ground. There's the drugs, homelessness, somebody sleeping there. It was really shocking, as if this kind of like a dystopia from a movie. Wow. And then police with horses. And then immediately I started to realize this is life here. The tolerance levels are very different in public realm. People tolerate each other in way higher degrees. And therefore, there's a whole slew of activities happening in the urban space. And I also started to realize that urban space was richer than anything I've ever seen in terms of the diversity of the activities and people. And my perspective changed on that. That is to say, maybe we're overemphasizing, and we're following some business interest by doing that because they want the clean front of their businesses.
We have the prospect of disease from people having to use our streets and alleys for defecation, and sooner or later we'll become like the Dark Ages when the disease spreads. I mean, it's a very real thing.
It is.
We're already feeling it in Denver with outbreaks of hepatitis A. So, it is very real. And when is urban planning going to start planning for places for the homeless? If you want to tolerate having homeless people as contributing to the rich diversity of urban life, you have to start taking care of their bodily functions.
I agree. Go ahead.
The current drift of urban planning, sprawl is always a really negative word, density is always a little positive word. But I wonder if you could address whether or not in your planning horizon, the way you teach, that an overemphasis on density can create its own social problems, diminish life quality, just like an overemphasis on sprawl did in the past. I personally think that density right now is like the mantra, and it has displaced the appropriate emphasis on quality of life that needs to be brought to an urban environment. And it's not just driven by the dollar, that's always the easy answer.
Yeah.
It's a developer and it's a dollar. It's really, truly a mindset of urban planning right now that the more compact or whatever the buzzwords you use, the more you push people together, the better it is. In some respects, it's more efficient. In some respects, that's true. In a lot of respects, it's not.
Yeah. Density itself is not the answer. It needs to have the other aspects. That is to say, the diversity of uses, self-sufficiency, the street life, the public realm, emphasis on that. And that's not easy. I mean, we see a lot of density with single use. That is to say, you go there, like 10 skyscrapers, all residential, maybe one tiny little store. That's not sustainable. And that's not going to create a better life. So density is kind of like the first in the list, and then there's the rest of the list you need to follow. I mean, in my own practice, the way we approach, we usually kind of get the density right in the beginning. Okay, this is an area, we cannot go more than this. This is culturally, politically, historically, this is how this area developed, and we can push to a degree. And within that density, what can we provide, the diversity, life, and self-sufficiency-wise? Now, there's also one other thing about that. You know, from 3-story, 4-story to 5, 6, there's a price jump in the construction. And you need to justify that. And you can do in certain places, and you cannot do in other places. And we come to, you know, the high-rises. Again, it's very limited markets who can absorb an expensive building like that. So, you know, even though Manhattan happens to be, you know, lowest carbon imprint and in terms of the life expectancies are higher, you cannot do Manhattan everywhere. So we...
In Denver, and it should be our model right now.
Yeah.
But the elimination, the diminishment of setbacks for apartment buildings, whether they're 2 stories, 4 stories, or 10 stories, has destroyed the walkability that you desire for sidewalks, because all there is anymore is 10 feet of concrete. Interspersed with potted plants.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead. Yes.
I think this gentleman's bringing up a very good point. Professor Onaran, I really enjoyed your lecture, and I actually have a master's degree. I've had seen similar things. You show the classic spaces in Western history that were, and they grew up over centuries, you know, often around a cathedral in towns where you couldn't build higher than the cathedral. They had rules like that. But they were built up over centuries around a pedestrian life. And what we have in Denver right now seems to be just this uncontrolled effort to maximize, to just get the most money out of a piece of land and densify as much as you can. And how can we, the street life that makes those cities so wonderful, how are we doing anything in Denver? Any kind of vision at all? I mean, it seems like you just let people build a 0 lot line, you know, just maximize as much, no public space around it. That's not even in the plan. I mean, what are we doing in Denver? I mean, this is an audience that we're very engaged in our city, and we talk about it. It's not an academic setting. These are real problems. I think we'd like to know, what do we change in this city, or the direction that we're going?
Okay. I mean, a couple of things. Density itself is not an answer, I said. But remember, even in those projects that you hate, 10-story building, I don't know, 100 units, those 100 units, the other alternative is going to the cornfields and doing suburban. And think about the gas, think about the expenses, think about the social injustice you're creating. So there's that side of it. We should not forget that side. That is to say, even though we're complaining, even though they're not creating good street life, they're doing one thing that is very important in our regional sustainability. No, it's not. So that's the second part of the answer. Second part of the answer is that, you know, the list, I should go back to the list actually. Sorry. It did create more affordable housing, because if you had that house in the suburbia, you have to drive there, and 30% of your...
People work from home. All I'm saying is about the people who lived in the city don't live in the city more because of density. In Denver, it's a perfect example. We live in the city less. Creating more apartments that are $1,500 a month don't make...
Okay, I disagree with that. I mean, look at the real estate. The highest value is in downtown. When you look at the foreclosures, all the peripheral towns had foreclosures. Suburbia had the highest foreclosures. Center did not have any foreclosures. So these statistics should tell you that actually Denver is very successful living city. That is to say, people live in Denver more than any other surrounding metropolitan areas, and that is a very important achievement. I'm not saying that that's the end of the story. I mean, the story starts with, you know, contiguous, compact, self-sufficiency. And to answer your question, every single context, you know, if the new code taught us one thing, that is, be context sensitive. Understand the context. In every given context, you cannot just cut and paste another project and put it there, which is what's happening. You need to understand the potential of that particular location to create supporting activities and uses. And most of the time, they are, you know, if you put 10,000 square feet ground floor retail, you're not going to be able to rent it everywhere. It's, you know, a lot of those rental places are empty because they are the wrong size or wrong thing. In a neighborhood, if you put smaller pieces of non-residential and program your activities, not only you can rent faster, you're creating much more attractive environment and you're going to sell much faster. So that's what we try to communicate with each developer. You know, it's not a cut and paste. Let's understand the potential of this particular area and let's invest in certain activities as overhead to make this place a really living place. I think I'm 5 minutes? Okay.
In this context, I'm going to ask a question. Your response might be actually a good reason to be my own, and that's fine. I think I share with a lot of people frustration around this participating in the variety of division neighborhood plans. Is it really a focal point, or is it a dog and pony show? And so, and I really genuinely feel like I don't know sometimes, even though the engagement can be very rich and there seems to be. So I would just be interested in your comment on the things that Denver is doing that say that it's engagement, and yet there's this whole other thing going on where the best ideas seem to be stopped because the development is continuing on another timeline, and the context considerations are not keeping up with a lot of this. So that doesn't mean it's all good or all bad. But
Yeah.
anytime where do you put your time, what does this really mean, and how do you track what is happening with what people are bringing to the table?
That's a good question. Where I put my time is learn from good practices, historic or new. Just what works here, what did it work? And we kind of think in the abstract a lot, and we forget to go out on the sidewalk and what is good here? You know, it's like learning from what we had is a very important aspect. And as such, when I walk in some of the established neighborhoods around downtown, every time I learn something else, you know, in different scales, in planning, how activities come together, et cetera, so forth. So there's a lot to learn from those. And then trying to carry those to the new mistakes and say, you know, hey, what you're doing is hurting you yourself as an investor. Are you aware of that? You know, because of this liability law, which is changing now, we started to see all these skyscrapers with ground floor residential. I couldn't believe that a developer would go and do it. Yeah, there's a market, they sell it, but then you create a horrible sidewalk. So those kind of things we need, and that's why I'm part of the Congress for the New Urbanism, because we keep fighting against those kind of things. So I think we need to cut. Okay, thank you. Sorry. I'll be here if you have other questions. I can.